You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 357 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I have some updates on Julian Assange's health and findings on the treatment of Julian Assange from a UN agency. I'm going to talk about the U.S. relationship with China, especially the increasing tensions between the U.S. and China surrounding Taiwan, the South China Sea. And then I have some news on the U.S. stance towards Iran and what the international watchdog on nuclear programs is saying about Iran's nuclear program. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where the show and my daily news roundup are featured in the right-hand column of the homepage. Make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. Give it a rating and review there. I update current events on the show, so the way you get the most out of it is by tuning into every episode. And if you really like the show, donate at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Alright everyone, today first up I have Assange's health. So me and Will talked about it pretty loosely on the last show, saying that we know it's bad, but we don't know how bad. We have some more clarity on that over the weekend. In detail, the UN rapporteur on torture said that basically when he has a conversation with Julian Assange, he's easily agitated and can't really focus and stay on subject. You know, this is not unexpected for somebody who's been put through the, psychological strain that Assange has been put through over the past 7 years. And then on top of that, also, not having all of his physical health needs met. His lawyers, I read, said that he's not getting better or worse treatment than the other prisoners in this prison. However, we know that prisoners don't get top treatment. And so somebody like Julian Assange, who is, probably has some pretty frail health conditions right now, is, we've known for a long time in the need of more serious medical attention, probably needs more medical care than is offered at this prison. And also, probably just for his psychological health, needs to be freed since he didn't do anything wrong, to start kind of readapting to the world and normalizing his mind a little bit. Now, the Rapporteur on Health put out a very strong statement absolutely blasting the US, UK, Sweden, and Ecuador for what the rapporteur called the worst treatment that he has seen by democratic states against an individual to, try to isolate him and smear him and attack him. And it's absolutely awful, and it's absolutely true. All along, what's been said here is that Julian Assange is hiding out in the embassy from the rape charges, when Julian Assange has made it very clear that he's willing to, answer or go through whatever steps he has. And he says he'll kind of vindicate him and prove his innocence to go through this Swedish court and go with those alleged rape charges or whatever. But what he's really afraid of is being renditioned or extradited to the United States, because there he would face Espionage Act charges, which they're basically persecuting a journalist for having classified information. And, this is something very dangerous because it's what all journalists do. And, we now know this is what's happening. In the U.S. is using the Espionage Act to go against Assange, looking for his extradition from the UK. And if he ends up in Sweden, possibly his rendition or extradition from that country as well. I also listened to an episode of the Scott Horton Show where Scott interviewed Daniel Ellsberg, and I'll link to that one in the show notes page, because not only do they do a really good job of covering why this whole thing is one of the most important things going on right now, but Daniel Ellsberg has a personal relationship with Julian Assange, is able to shed some lights on his dental and physical health needs as well. Moving on, the U.S. is contracting with, I believe, 5 different European countries, $11 million in total contracts, to develop small drones that I guess could kind of be standard issue to soldiers and have them carried around within their standard issue gear, would have a range of 3 kilometers, so that's over 1.5 miles or over 2 miles, and I'm guessing would be explosive, and this would be some kind of tactical gear all U.S. soldiers would then carry. I kind of want to add this in just because of me and Will on the past show talked about, the second age and more drone proliferation. I think this is another example of it. Certainly we're seeing these kind of things in asymmetric warfare where terrorist groups are using, drones that I think they're mostly buying on Amazon, or I shouldn't say they're buying them on Amazon, but companies like Amazon, you buy them online or from wherever, and you strap them up with some explosives, and then, you're able to send them off at your target and hit it with a good amount of explosives attached on board. And I have heard from, different troops that have used these type of weapons in the field that they are pretty effective. A few weeks ago, a series of bombs went off across a French city. I don't think anyone was killed, but 13 people were injured in the attacks. And of course, there's the fear, and this was a terrorist attack. The guy who did it is now claiming loyalty to ISIS. And so it's just another reminder that there's blowback to Western action and interference in the Middle East and North Africa, and that our Western allies, especially those in Europe, have really felt that with several terrorist attacks in recent years. Russia has responded to the U.S. claims that Russia is violating the zero-yield nuclear test ban, claiming that Russia is testing some kind of nuclear weapons. Russia called it a smear, says it's absolutely not happening. Of course, the U.S. didn't provide any evidence for it, so it's kind of impossible to weigh here. But another source of tension on the nuclear issue between the United States and Russia. Next up here, I'm talking about China. I'm starting off first with the issue in Taiwan, where I'm sure most of my audience generally understands this, that China claims that Taiwan is a part of China, and Taiwan claims to be an independent state, and this has been the situation for several years. America has mostly sat on the fence here, while at the same time agreeing with China, oh yeah, there's the one China policy that we agree with, having a relationship with Taiwan, and for many years kind of having an understanding in American foreign policy that the U.S. would help Taiwan repel an invasion from China. At one point in time, maybe Taiwan could have independently prevented China from invading. Now it just seems to me, looking at the military power, depending on how much China was willing to lose. I mean, Taiwan could probably certainly inflict a lot of damage on the Chinese mainland should China want to invade. But China could, at the end of the day, depending on how many losses they were willing to accept, invade Taiwan with, if they didn't have American support. Now, in the past, the U.S. relationship with Taiwan was pretty limited in that, they didn't have high-level meetings between the two countries, and I think the U.S. only, if ever, sailed warships through the Taiwan Strait about once a year. And it's this that America kind of says that we're agreeing that Taiwan is its own independent separate entity that could give us permission to sail between the Taiwanese island and the Chinese mainland, because if Taiwan is a part of China, then all that water is controlled by China, and certainly American warships wouldn't be able to sail through there. All of this is documented in an article by Galen Carpenter. I believe we're at the American Conservative, and it's linked in the show notes page for those of you who want more details on some kind of recent behind-the-scenes moves, I would guess in the past 5 years or so, where Carpenter kind of just goes back through and documents how this is becoming a little bit more of a hostile issue. On its own, I wouldn't say this is extremely concerning or a potential breakout spot for war. When I was in high school and college, 10 to 5 years ago now, and was a debater, one of the kind of common arguments that everybody would use is that, China and Taiwan was a flashpoint for worldwide nuclear weapons. Independently on its own, I definitely don't see that as a case. Although you have, a bunch of people who I think disproportionately go on to become congressmen and representatives at different levels, former debaters, that all have this kind of trope that they use that, China and Taiwan, that's U.S. has to go to the gates of hell for Taiwan, and nuclear warfare is, what we'll do to defend that island. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but there are some other points of tension between the U.S. and China right now, certainly in the South China Sea, and I've documented that on past episodes of the show. I don't know if there's a whole lot more I have to add, except that Galen Carpenter points out in his article that Taiwan, in part of asserting its independence, has also started to assert some territorial claims to the South China Sea. So that could be another issue with China. And then the U.S. continuing to fly, either military planes or ships around those waters in defiance of Chinese territorial claims. Now, one potential solution to this whole Taiwan issue would be for Taiwan to accept some kind of deal with China for in-name only reunification. This is something like what Hong Kong at one time had, where they were pretty much a completely separate entity and, making their own decisions and not being part of communist China. And I think slowly, though, they've, kind of become more and more part of the rest of the Chinese mainland. And Taiwan says, they're afraid of that happening, so they wouldn't accept that solution. Now, another issue of concern between the U.S. and China is this Chinese tech company Huawei that produces 5G phones, and the U.S. has decided to, for whatever reason, go to trade war over this thing, saying they can't, secure American data on the phone. This is something I mentioned in the past on the show. The new development now is the U.S. is really putting pressure on our European allies to go along with our ban on the Huawei products. In fact, in Germany, Mike Pompeo told his counterpart that if Germany doesn't follow suit with the ban, then the United States would stop sharing our data with Germany, which is kind of interesting, right? That, this is all about apparently American kind of data privacy security. And here Mike Pompeo is leveraging American security to the Germans. Or I guess I should say American, privacy and private information and everything. So, that plus the trade war is another point for contention. Also, apparently the acting Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, is a big China hawk, and I'm not sure I understand why. Maybe it has to do something with him being a longtime Boeing executive. I'm hoping to find a good article that may detail why Shanahan keys so much in on China. When he first took over as acting Secretary of Defense, he said his focus is going to be China, China, China. Now he's been nominated to be the Secretary of Defense. It was looking like he may have some trouble getting confirmed. However, he gave a big speech where he said that, we're not going to be tiptoeing around Chinese territorial interests in the South China Sea anymore. We're done with this whole China gets, some more control in their whole neighborhood. And what we're going to do is be more aggressive. Now, we've already been more aggressive. And so if he's just kind of talking about what's happened up till now, that's one thing. But if he's talking about adding to that and maybe selling more ships around the South China Sea or something like that, it could certainly provoke increased tensions with China and also the possibility of an accident. And we've seen this before. Under the first Bush administration, I believe there was a spy plane or drone that went down near China. And then it may have been under Obama or right at the beginning of Trump, there was a U.S. ship that almost ran into a Chinese ship in the South China Sea. And it's not so much just that Patrick Shanahan says this, but it's that he says this and then you have senators like Tammy Duckworth and Angus King, who are soon going to be voting on Patrick Shanahan for, being confirmed, saying that, he says this, so now we really like this guy. China from their end says the U.S. is playing with fire here. I haven't seen them, saying that they're going to take any solid steps on confronting the U.S. really anywhere other than the trade issue so far. The U.S. and Indonesian State Department officials met with each other and talked about increasing relationships between the special forces units. The problem here is that the U.S. or the Indonesian special forces units have a history of committing war crimes, especially in East Timor. There's a lot of reports out that Kim Jong-un has executed his nuclear negotiation team. If this is true, it is certainly something that would be concerning, just because if you're in the middle of negotiations, and especially part of this is, trying to become a more normal nation for North Korea and brought into the international fold, if you're executing your nuclear negotiation team, the team that's negotiating with the West, that probably doesn't look so great. But you have great analysis by Moon of Alabama saying, whoa, everybody, let's not jump too fast here. And I'll link to this in the show notes page. But basically, he just highlights past cases where they said that Kim Jong-un executed an ex-girlfriend and I believe a relative of his. And it turned out in both of these cases that they end up being promoted and not dead. In Israel, we have some issues with the Ramadan holiday going on. There's some increased tensions. There was I want to call it clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is, one of the holiest sites in Islam, I believe the third holiest, and also around holy areas of Jerusalem for the Jewish people, where I think typically Jewish people aren't allowed around the mosque during the first 10 days of Ramadan. And for the first time in 30 years, they were allowed there. Their presence sparked kind of hostilities, not necessarily, anybody being injured or killed, but, maybe throwing things at each other and hurling insults between Palestinians and Jewish people. This eventually results in Israeli forces getting involved and, I guess, tear gassing and firing rubber bullets at the Palestinians. We also had the case of a Palestinian stabbing 2 Israelis and then being shot dead by Israeli forces. And then a Palestinian teenager was jumping what they call a security fence that divides the West Bank and Israel and then was shot dead by Israeli defense forces. That last one I think we should really highlight here because, this isn't even Gaza. This is the West Bank, the area of Israel where the Palestinians have a little bit better treatment. But even here, jumping a fence apparently is a capital crime and gets you shot. The IAEA, the International Watchdog Group for Nuclear Weapons, tasked with enforcing the Iran nuclear deal, certifies for the 15th time that Iran is complying with the nuclear deal. They're not enriching uranium too high. They're not building nuclear weapons. They're not storing too much nuclear material. Nope, they're doing everything they're asked to do, even though the U.S. has left the deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran. The reason this is, a really big deal to Iran isn't just that the U.S. sanctions have been enforced, but that the U.S. has gotten other countries around the world to go along with the sanctions. And so even though Europe has tried to persuade some European companies to continue to do business with Iran, at the end of the day, the threat of U.S. secondary sanctions is enough to keep these companies from doing any business with Iran. And so I guess this is really starting to hurt the Iranian economy. I think at one point there, Iran was doing about 3 million barrels of oil sold a day. That's now under 1 million barrels sold. So, that's a blow to their economy. The IAEA in the report did express some questions about Iran using more advanced centrifuges. They had announced that they're increasing the rate, not the percentage of enriched uranium, but just the rate that they're processing that, which is apparently allowed under the deal. From the U.S. position, we have some statements. Trump seems to be moving more towards the diplomatic end, and tensions between the U.S. and Iran seem to cool down a few notches. Even John Bolton said that the deployment of U.S. troops to the region was an effective deterrence. However, the threat from Iran to attack U.S. interests is not over. We also had a statement from the U.S. envoy to Iran saying that if Iran attacks U.S. interests, the U.S. will respond militarily. I'm not feeling the greatest today, so I'm going to wrap up the show there a little early, but I think I got through most of the important news that I had. Hope everybody's enjoying the show. Please make sure you share it. Go to the Libertarian Institute and then click the share button, whether it's, to Facebook or Twitter or, control copy the link, send it to a friend and say, hey man, I'm really enjoying this. Stay up to date on the Empire. That's the best thing you could do for the show. Make sure you subscribe to it somewhere, especially if you're new, you like the show, you don't want to miss an episode. iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify should be everywhere. And then think about donating to the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.